The money will go to pay for your sister's vacation. My mother said it so calmly, like she was talking about dinner plans instead of the house my father left me. I'm Miranda Hayes, 29, living in a small town near Nashville, and I've always believed peace was worth more than winning an argument. But that night, I learned the home I inherited had already been sold without my knowledge. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just stood there and realized silence might be sharper than any fight. Growing up in our house never felt chaotic on the surface. There were no slammed doors, no shattered plates, no neighbors whispering about arguments through thin walls. From the outside, we looked steady, organized, functional. But stability can be quiet and uneven at the same time. My mother, Deborah, never needed to raise her voice to control a room. She carried authority in the way she stood, in the pauses between her sentences, in the subtle lift of her eyebrow when something displeased her. The emotional temperature of our home shifted with her moods, and everyone felt it instantly. If she was calm, the air felt breathable. If she was disappointed even slightly, the walls seemed to close in. What made it harder to name was that she rarely shouted. She didn't need to. Her control worked through approval, through withdrawal, through the silent understanding that certain reactions would create tension we would all have to live inside. Decisions, big or small, moved through her invisible filter first. What we wore to family gatherings, how we spoke to relatives, even the timing of simple plans. It was never announced as a rule. It was just understood, and we adjusted. My father, Thomas, brought a different energy into the house. He believed in routine, in showing up for work every day, in keeping bills paid and dinner predictable. He wasn't cold. He wasn't distant. But when tension surfaced, he softened instead of standing firm. If mom grew sharp, he would suggest patience. If a disagreement started to take shape, he would redirect the conversation or let it fade. He believed calm could be preserved if conflict was avoided long enough. As a child, I mistook that for strength. Later, I realized it was something closer to surrender. Not dramatic surrender, not obvious. Just a quiet choice to let the stronger current pull the family in one direction, rather than risk rocking the boat. Then there was my sister, Vanessa. Vanessa moved through the house with an ease that I never quite understood. She didn't seem to calculate her words the way I did. When she changed her mind, it was accepted. When she forgot responsibilities, someone else quietly picked up the slack. If she wanted something, the conversation naturally bent toward how to make it happen. No one ever said she was favored. There were no declarations, but patterns don't need announcements to exist. When choices had to be made, where to go, what to prioritize, how to spend time, the outcome usually aligned with what benefited Vanessa. And if it didn't, it eventually would. I remember watching those small adjustments happen over and over, like water finding the easiest path downhill. At around 10 years old, I began noticing the cost of speaking too quickly. I would start a sentence and feel the shift in the room before I finished it. A slight pause from my mother, a glance exchanged between my parents, a tightening in the air that made me wish I could pull my words back into my mouth. So I learned to hold them there instead. I started weighing my thoughts before offering them. Was this worth being noticed? Was this worth the subtle disappointment that might follow? Was this worth the quiet correction that would come later when no one else was around? Restraint became something I practiced. Not because I was naturally quiet, but because I understood that being visible carried a price. By my teenage years, shrinking had become instinctive. When conversations grew layered with tension, I stepped aside. When opinions clashed, I observed instead of participating. I watched how Vanessa could push back without consequences, how she could express frustration openly and still be met with understanding. Meanwhile, I was expected to absorb, to adapt, to be the reasonable one. My mother never said, "You should understand more." She didn't have to. The message lived in the way tasks were assigned, in the way mistakes were remembered, in the way disappointment lingered longer when it came from me. If Vanessa forgot something, it was brushed off as stress or distraction. If I did, it became a lesson about responsibility. If Vanessa felt overwhelmed, accommodations were made. If I felt overwhelmed, I was reminded that maturity meant handling things quietly. Over time, I stopped expecting balance. Dad would occasionally try to smooth the edges. He would suggest giving things time. He would tell me not to take everything so seriously. His voice carried warmth, but not weight. It was comfort without correction, kindness without change. And so the structure remained exactly as it was. I don't remember a single dramatic moment where I decided to become quiet. It happened slowly, through observation, through endurance, through the understanding that fairness was not something I could request and receive. It was something I would eventually have to create for myself. Silence stopped feeling like weakness. It started feeling strategic. When you grow up in a house where the rules are unwritten but strictly enforced, you develop a kind of discipline that doesn't come from guidance. It comes from reading the room, from sensing shifts before they fully form, from learning that reacting emotionally often strengthens the very dynamic you're trying to escape. So I focused on control, not control over other people. I never had that. But control over my reactions, my tone, my timing, my internal world. If I couldn't reshape the structure, I could at least stabilize myself inside it. By the time I reached my late teens, I had mastered the art of neutrality. I could sit through pointed comments without flinching. I could absorb subtle criticism without defending myself. I could watch decisions unfold in predictable directions and keep my face steady. From the outside, it probably looked like maturity. Inside, it was containment. The imbalance in our home wasn't loud. It was quiet and persistent. It lived in glances and pauses, in the weight of expectation that followed me from room to room. And because it was subtle, it was harder to challenge. There was nothing obvious to fight against. Nothing you could point to and say, that's unfair. It was a pattern, and patterns are slippery. So I adapted. I became the daughter who didn't complicate things, the sister who didn't compete, the presence that didn't demand space. I told myself that peace was more valuable than being right, that calm was more important than recognition. And maybe at the time that was true. But what I didn't realize back then was that every moment of silence was shaping something inside me. Not fragility, not resentment, precision. Because when you spend years learning how to stay quiet in a room full of unspoken rules, you also learn how to listen. And listening, real listening, can become a kind of power. No one notices until it's too late. 2 months after my father passed, the house felt heavier than it ever had before. Grief was there, of course. It lingered in small things, the empty chair at the table, the quiet hum of the television. No one was really watching, but beneath the sadness, something else moved through the rooms. Something tighter, less visible, like tension wrapped carefully in polite behavior. The reading of the will happened on a gray afternoon that matched everyone's tone. We sat in a small office that smelled faintly of paper and dust. My mother's hands were folded neatly in her lap. Vanessa scrolled on her phone until the meeting began. I remember focusing on the sound of pages turning as if the rhythm might prepare me for whatever came next. The document was clear. There was no dramatic buildup, no surprise clause hidden at the end. My father had transferred full ownership of the house to me. Not shared ownership, not partial rights. Full legal control. For a moment, no one reacted. The air didn't crack. No one protested. The words simply existed in the room, steady and undeniable. I felt something shift inside me. Not excitement, not triumph. Just a quiet awareness that something solid had been placed in my hands. Then I looked at my mother. Deborah's expression remained composed. Her voice, when she spoke, stayed soft and measured. She even nodded once, as if acknowledging a detail in a routine conversation. But her posture changed. It was subtle. Her shoulders straightened slightly. Her spine stiffened in a way that suggested recalculation rather than acceptance. Vanessa didn't speak immediately either. She glanced at me, then at Mom, then back at the papers. Her silence wasn't passive. It was alert. The meeting ended without confrontation. We walked out together. No raised voices, no accusations. Just careful steps and controlled breathing. But something had shifted. In the days that followed, the house didn't feel like home in the same way. It felt staged. Like everyone was suddenly aware of invisible cameras watching how we moved around one another. Mom's tone with me became unusually polite. She asked questions that sounded casual but carried weight underneath. Where are you keeping the documents? Did the lawyer explain everything clearly? Are you sure you understand the responsibilities? They were framed as concern, but the repetition felt deliberate. Vanessa began appearing in conversations she had never shown interest in before. If I mentioned a call with the attorney, she would linger in the doorway. If papers were left on the dining table, she would glance at them a second too long. She started asking about property taxes, about maintenance, about long-term plans. It wasn't curiosity, it was positioning. That's when I scheduled a private meeting with the lawyer handling the estate, Daniel Brooks. Daniel wasn't warm in an emotional sense, but he was precise, grounded. The kind of person who spoke carefully because he understood the weight of language. When I sat across from him in his office, I didn't dramatize anything. I simply asked him to confirm clearly and directly what the will meant. He reviewed the documents again, line by line, even though he had already explained them once. The ownership is yours alone, he said, finally looking at me over the top of the file. The transfer is legally sound. It was signed, witnessed, and recorded properly. There are no loopholes here. I asked him the question I hadn't dared to say out loud at home. Can anyone override it? He didn't hesitate. Not without legal consequences. Representation rights don't apply here. The will is structured specifically to prevent interference. There was something stabilizing about the way he said it. Not emotional reassurance, just legal clarity. the law recognized what my father had decided. Whether others accepted it or not didn't change that. When I returned home, I carried that certainty quietly. I didn't announce it. I didn't use it as leverage. I simply observed. Mom began watching her words more carefully when I entered a room. Conversations would soften mid-sentence. Plans that once would have included automatic assumptions now paused, waiting for my input. But even that pause felt measured, like someone testing how much space I would claim. Vanessa's approach changed too. She stopped asking direct questions and started offering suggestions instead. Maybe the house would benefit from renovations. Have you thought about long-term investment potential? It could be more valuable if handled strategically. On the surface, they sounded helpful, but beneath them, I felt the shift. It was no longer about shared family space. It was about influence. The strangest part was this. I was legally the owner of the house, yet I felt less comfortable inside it than ever before. There were no loud arguments, no explosive confrontations, just a steady build of pressure in small, almost forgettable moments. A glance that lingered too long, a pause before answering me, a tone that sharpened for half a second before smoothing out again. I could feel something being negotiated constantly without the word ever being spoken. The inheritance wasn't just about property, it was about control. About who decided what mattered inside that family structure. For the first time in my life, I wasn't shrinking, but I also wasn't expanding. I was watching. I listened to what wasn't said. I noticed how often my name came up only when decisions needed to be redirected. I paid attention to the way Vanessa's confidence rose in certain discussions, how Mom's concerns subtly carried expectation. They weren't confronting me openly. They were adjusting, testing, measuring. And instead of reacting like I might have, years ago, I stayed quiet. Not because I felt small, but because I understood something I hadn't before. When the ground shifts beneath people who are used to standing firmly in control, they reveal themselves in tiny movements, and I intended to see every one of them. The shift from tension to certainty didn't happen inside the house. It started across the fence. One afternoon, my neighbor Mrs. Turner approached me while I was checking the mailbox. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't gossiping. Her voice carried the careful tone of someone who had debated whether to speak at all. "I've seen a few unfamiliar people walking around your property," she said slowly. "They've been taking pictures, stepping close to the fence. I thought you should know." There was no exaggeration in her words, just observation. I thanked her, kept my expression neutral, and walked back toward the house. From a distance, everything looked the same. The siding hadn't changed. The porch swing still moved slightly in the breeze. The lawn was trimmed. But the second my eyes reached the edge of the yard, something inside me tightened. A large sign stood near the driveway. "Sold." The words sat in bold letters across the center, unapologetic and public. For a moment, I didn't move. I didn't feel anger rush through me. I didn't even feel confusion, just stillness. How could something that legally belonged to me be presented to the world as finished business? I didn't storm into the house. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I got into my car and drove to the real estate office listed at the bottom of the sign. The woman behind the front desk greeted me politely. I returned the politeness. I told her I had questions about a recent transaction involving my property. I didn't accuse her. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked to see the documentation. She hesitated for only a second before turning to her computer. I watched her eyes scan the screen. The longer she looked, the more deliberate her movements became. "Yes," she said finally. "The sale was completed. The transfer is recorded." "Under whose authorization?" I asked. She turned the monitor slightly toward herself, reviewing the details more carefully. "The paperwork shows representation signed by your mother," she explained. "The documents appear complete and properly filed." I waited. "And my name?" I asked quietly. She paused, looked again. Her tone softened almost imperceptibly. "Your name doesn't appear in the signature section." That was it. No dramatic reveal, no hidden clause, just absence. I nodded, thanked her for her time, and walked out without another word. The air outside felt heavier than it had an hour earlier, but my steps remained steady. I didn't cry in the parking lot. I didn't call Daniel immediately. I didn't confront anyone on the drive home. I needed to see her face when I asked. When I entered the house, everything looked ordinary. Vanessa's voice drifted faintly from the living room. The kitchen light was on. The refrigerator hummed. I waited until Mom walked in. She looked at me the way she always did, calm, composed, as if the world operated according to her internal schedule. I stood near the counter, my hands resting lightly against the surface to keep them steady. "Why was the house sold without my knowledge?" I asked. No accusation, no tremor. Her eyes met mine without flinching. "You don't get to question me," she replied. The words landed cleanly between us. Not shouted, not emotional, just controlled. For a brief second, I wondered if she would soften, if she would explain it as a misunderstanding, a mistake, some procedural confusion. Instead, her voice grew firmer. "The money will go to pay for your sister's vacation," she said. No argument. Vanessa stood nearby, close enough to hear every word. She didn't look surprised. She didn't step in to correct anything. She didn't even look uncomfortable. Her expression remained still, almost detached, as if this had already been decided long before I discovered the sign. I didn't scream. I didn't ask how she thought she had the right. I didn't remind her of the will or the signatures or the legal confirmation I had already received. I just stood there, not because I agreed, not because I felt defeated, but because something in me understood that words would not move this moment backward. The transaction had already been completed. The papers had already been filed. The sign had already been planted in the ground for strangers to see. Silence felt more honest than begging. The kitchen seemed smaller than usual, the air tighter. The house that had once felt heavy with tension now felt transactional, completed, rearranged without my consent. What stayed with me most wasn't even the sale itself. It was a certainty in her voice, as if decisions about my future, about my father's final choice, could be made cleanly over me, around me, without me. I didn't argue because I understood something with absolute clarity in that moment. My voice couldn't undo what had already happened, but my actions still could. That night, I didn't sit in my room replaying the conversation. I didn't pace. I didn't cry into a pillow. I didn't draft long messages I would never send. I opened my laptop. There's a strange kind of clarity that comes when emotion burns off quickly. What's left isn't softness. It isn't rage either. It's focus. And that's what settled over me as I began pulling every document I had into one place. Even small details I had saved out of. Even small details I had saved out of habit months earlier without knowing why. I organized everything into folders with Careful labels, building a timeline not out of anger, but out of structure. If something had been done improperly, it would show itself in the details. By the time the house fell completely silent, I had already made my decision. I grabbed the physical copies of the documents, slid them into a folder, and left, without telling anyone where I was going. The streets felt emptier than usual as I drove. Not dramatic, just still. When I pulled into the small parking lot outside Daniel's office, only one light was on behind the frosted glass. He opened the door before I could second-guess myself. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He looked at my face for a few seconds, stepped aside, and let me walk in. I placed the folder on his desk and began laying everything out in front of him. Deed records, confirmation emails, registry, timestamps, printed copies of the transfer documentation I had requested from the real estate office earlier that day. "I need you to look at all of it," I said quietly. He nodded and sat down. Daniel didn't rush. He never did. He adjusted the stack so the pages aligned perfectly, then began reviewing them one by one. The only sounds in the room were the soft turn of paper and the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. His fingers paused at certain signatures. He leaned closer to specific authorization stamps. At one point, his breathing shifted almost imperceptibly. When he finally looked up, his expression hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had sharpened. "The signature attributed to your mother in the representation section shows irregular pressure patterns," he said evenly. "See here." He turned the page toward me. The pen stroke begins heavy, then thins unnaturally. "That suggests hesitation or guided tracing." I didn't react. I just listened. He flipped to another page. The timing of the authorization also conflicts with registry protocol. The transfer was processed under representation rights that don't apply under the structure of your father's will. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means she claimed authority she did not legally possess." He continued reviewing. "The will is structured specifically to prevent third-party override. Representation rights would only activate under incapacity or joint ownership conditions. Neither applies here." He leaned back slightly. "This isn't a misunderstanding," he added. "It's a misuse of authority. And the fact that the paperwork appears clean at a surface level suggests it was processed quickly, possibly without proper scrutiny." The words didn't hit me like a shockwave. They settled slowly, like confirmation of something I already sensed. "Can it be challenged?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Formally, through legal channels. The inconsistencies are substantial enough to trigger review. And if the court determines procedural misconduct, the transfer can be frozen or reversed." He didn't dramatize it. He didn't promise victory. He just outlined the structure. I looked at the papers again, then back at him. "I don't want this handled emotionally," I said. "I don't want calls made. I don't want warnings given. I don't want anyone in my family to know this is being reviewed until it has to be." Daniel held my gaze for a moment, measuring the seriousness in my tone. "That's possible," he replied, "but it will require discretion. I want everything prepared quietly," I continued. "Every document cross-checked, every timestamp verified, every irregularity documented. No trail that leads back to me until the formal process begins." There was no anger in my voice, just precision. He nodded once, understood, and he began working immediately. He scanned each document into a secure system. He cross-referenced registry entries with official filing times. He He prepared certified copies and flagged procedural conflicts that most people would overlook. He drafted formal complaints structured around statutory language rather than emotional claims. Watching him work felt different from watching my family maneuver inside the house. This wasn't about tone or posture. It was about evidence, structure, systems that operated independently of anyone's personal influence. Hours passed without unnecessary conversation. When I finally stood to leave, the file on his desk had grown thicker, more organized, more deliberate. From this point forward, he said calmly, the process moves through official channels. It won't require your presence immediately. I nodded. Good. When I stepped back outside, the night air felt sharper, but it didn't feel threatening. It felt clean. Back at home, nothing had changed. The kitchen light was off. Vanessa's door was closed. My mother's room was dark. I walked inside quietly as if I had never left. The difference was invisible. They believed the transaction was complete. They believed the decision had been finalized. They believed silence meant acceptance. But this time, silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. And preparation, when done carefully enough, doesn't need noise to carry weight. The days that followed were strangely ordinary. No one mentioned the real estate office. No one asked if I had questions. The house moved through its usual rhythms, coffee in the morning, doors closing softly at night, the television murmuring in the background like nothing irreversible had happened. And I matched that rhythm perfectly. I didn't confront Vanessa. I didn't avoid her either. I moved through the kitchen when she was there. I sat at the table during dinner. I responded when spoken to. My tone stayed even, my expressions neutral. If they were waiting for an explosion, it never came. Online, though, the atmosphere was different. Vanessa's social media shifted almost overnight. Photos of luggage laid open across her bed, close-up shots of new outfits still folded in tissue paper, captions hinting at much-needed escapes, and finally treating myself. There were blurred glimpses of reservation confirmations, tagged locations in warm climates, smiling selfies with comments from friends about how she deserved it. I didn't scroll for long. I didn't leave comments. I didn't analyze who liked the posts or who asked questions about funding. I simply observed the confidence in the images, the assumption that everything was secure, settled, guaranteed. Then I closed the app. Inside the house, I became quieter than usual, but not withdrawn. There's a difference. I wasn't sulking. I wasn't distant. I just stopped offering emotional access. When conversations drifted toward future plans, I listened. When opinions were floated into the air, I didn't counter them. I let them believe what they wanted to believe. 3 days later, my phone rang before sunrise. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Silence had become something steady in my hands, and I was careful about when to set it down. But I answered, "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end. Not long, just long enough to feel deliberate. "My dear," my mother said softly, "can we talk?" Her voice no longer carried the sharp certainty from the kitchen. It sounded measured, controlled in a different way, as if every word had been tested before being released. "I'm listening," I replied. She didn't jump straight into the point. Instead, she circled it. "Families sometimes make decisions under pressure," she began. Sometimes things feel right in the moment, but later, when emotions settle, perspectives change. No apology, no admission, just distance from the action as if it had happened in weather rather than by choice. She spoke about misunderstandings, about how complicated estates can become, about how outsiders sometimes escalate matters that should remain private. Her tone suggested concern not for me but for exposure. We don't need to involve anyone else, she added tearfully. If there's discomfort, we can reach an understanding between us. Quietly, the word lingered. Quietly. As if secrecy were a form of healing, I let her speak without interruption. I wanted to hear how far she would go without naming the truth. Her sentences kept orbiting the center but never touching it. She never said the house shouldn't have been sold. She never said my consent should have mattered. She never said she was wrong. Instead, she suggested compromise. Perhaps we can redistribute things in a way that feels fair, she said. There's no need for conflict, no need for outsiders to complicate our family. There it was again. Not remorse, not repair. Control. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not satisfaction. Just clarity. When she finally stopped speaking, the silence stretched between us. I could hear her breathing, steady but cautious, waiting for a sign of softness. I'm not interested in a private agreement, I said calmly. No raised voice, no explanation. She hesitated. Miranda. I've already considered everything, I continued, still steady. There's nothing to negotiate. The shift happened in that space, not because I argued, not because I accused, but because I didn't bend. For years, my silence had meant accommodation, understanding, patience. This time it meant refusal. She tried once more, her tone thinner now. We're family. We can resolve this internally. We already have, I replied, and I ended the call. There was no dramatic aftermath. No shouting through walls. No immediate confrontation in the hallway. The house remained physically the same, but something invisible had tilted. Vanessa's post slowed over the next few days. The tone shifted from celebration to vagueness. Plans became less specific. Captions lost their certainty. At home, my mother watched me differently. Not with authority, with calculation. The balance of power hadn't shifted through force. It shifted because I stopped reacting in the way they expected. Silence this time wasn't compliance. It was distance. And distance is harder to control than anger will ever be. The courtroom felt colder than it should have. The air conditioned into something sharp and impersonal. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, reflecting off polished wood and gray stone. Everything in the room seemed designed to mute emotion. Straight lines, hard surfaces, measured distance between people who once shared a dinner table. Miranda sat beside Daniel Brooks with her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore no visible expression of anger, no trace of triumph. If anything, she appeared composed to the point of invisibility. Across the aisle, Deborah's posture was upright but less fluid than usual, her shoulders drawn tighter than Miranda had ever seen at home. Vanessa dressed carefully, but without her usual sparkle, kept adjusting the strap of her handbag as though it anchored her. When the proceedings began, there were no raised voices, no dramatic objections, only the soft cadence of formal language moving through the room. Daniel stood with quiet assurance, He did not dramatize, he did not accuse. He laid documents on the table one at a time, each aligned with deliberate precision. His voice remained even as he explained the sequence of events, the title history, the authority granted under the will, the absence of any legally valid representation rights. Transferring decision-making power to Deborah, he directed the court's attention to the signatures first. "With respect, Your Honor," he said calmly, "the documentation submitted during the property transfer contains material inconsistencies." He passed forward enlarged copies, side-by-side comparisons. Miranda watched the judge lean forward slightly, reading without visible reaction. The irregularities were subtle but unmistakable when examined carefully. The angle of the letters, the pressure patterns, the spacing inconsistent with Miranda's authenticated signature samples. Daniel did not call it fraud outright. He referred instead to procedural conflicts and invalid execution of authority. He outlined how the will had granted full and sole ownership to Miranda upon her father's passing. No co-ownership, no conditional language, no delegation of authority for sale. He paused after each section, allowing the evidence to sit in the silence. Deborah's attorney attempted to frame the matter as a misunderstanding, a familial miscommunication during a time of grief. The explanation suggested that Deborah believed she was acting in the family's best interest, that she assumed, perhaps incorrectly, she retained practical oversight of the property. The judge asked a simple question. Was written authorization from the titled owner obtained prior to sale? There was a brief shuffle of papers, a glance between Deborah and her counsel. The answer when it came was careful. "No, Your Honor." Vanessa was called to testify next. She walked to the stand with visible effort to maintain composure. Her voice was controlled but thinner than usual. She spoke about conversations at home, about assumptions that the house was a family asset. She avoided stating directly that she knew Miranda had not signed anything. Instead, she described being told that arrangements had been handled, that everything was taken care of. Daniel did not press aggressively. He asked only clarifying questions. "Did you ever see Miranda sign any transfer documents?" "No." "Did she ever verbally confirm to you that she agreed to the sale?" Vanessa hesitated. "No." The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was procedural, yet it carried weight. Miranda did not look at her sister. She kept her gaze forward, breathing evenly, listening as though the case concerned someone else entirely. Months earlier, she might have tried to explain, to soften, to justify her position. Now, she understood that explanation was unnecessary. The record spoke clearly. Deborah took the stand last. For years, she had commanded rooms with quiet authority. At home, her words carried finality. In the courtroom, that authority thinned. Her posture remained straight, but her certainty seemed to recede with each question. She maintained that she believed she was protecting the family's financial interests, that selling the property was practical, that she intended to distribute funds responsibly. Daniel's questions remained restrained. "Were you aware that the will specified sole ownership?" "Yes." "Did you obtain written consent from the owner before initiating the sale?" A pause, not long but visible. "No." The judge's pen moved steadily across the page. There were no gasps, no dramatic shifts in the gallery, just the steady movement of process, correcting imbalance. After closing statements, the courtroom returned to its quiet hum. The judge reviewed the documentation one final time. The language of the ruling was measured neutral. Based on the evidence presented, the court finds sufficient indication of procedural irregularity in the transfer of the property in question. Pending further review, a temporary freeze of all disputed assets is hereby ordered. The words landed without spectacle, a freeze. Not a victory, not a condemnation, simply a pause. An official recognition that something required correction. Deborah's shoulders lowered slightly, though she quickly composed herself. Vanessa's gaze dropped to her lap. Their confidence had not shattered. It had thinned, receded into uncertainty. Miranda remained still. She did not smile. She did not look relieved. Instead, she absorbed the ruling with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. The freeze was not revenge. It was alignment, an acknowledgement that authority must follow law, not assumption. As people began to gather their papers, Daniel leaned toward her. "This is the first step," he said quietly. She nodded. Outside, the air felt warmer than the courtroom. The world moved normally, cars passing distant conversations, sunlight reflecting off pavement. Nothing outwardly dramatic had occurred. No public humiliation, no triumphant declaration. Only quiet correction. For the first time since the sold sign appeared on the lawn, the imbalance had been formally acknowledged. Not through shouting, not through confrontation, through patience, through evidence, through silence used with precision. And in that controlled stillness, the shift was unmistakable. In the 6 months that followed the court's decision, the consequences unfolded slowly, without spectacle. In Nashville, Deborah's certainty began to erode in quiet ways. Church acquaintances who once sought her advice now kept conversations brief. Extended relatives stopped asking her to coordinate gatherings. No one confronted her directly. They simply recalibrated their distance. Reputation, Miranda realized, rarely collapses in a single moment. It thins thread by thread. Vanessa's plans unraveled more visibly. The celebratory travel posts disappeared. Reservations were canceled. The friends who had commented with excitement shifted to careful silence. Without access to the disputed funds, her financial stability proved fragile. What had once seemed like a carefree future narrowed into repayment schedules and difficult explanations. The family itself divided without formal announcement. Some relatives quietly reached out to Miranda with restrained words of support. Others remained aligned with Deborah out of loyalty or habit. Holidays fractured into smaller gatherings. Invitations became selective. The old illusion of unity dissolved, replaced by something more honest if less comfortable. Miranda did not stay to watch it unfold. She left Nashville before summer ended. The decision was not dramatic. She did not announce it widely. She simply accepted a position in a new city and packed what belonged to her. Distance, she discovered, was not escape, it was clarity. In her new home, she rented at first. She worked deliberately, saved carefully, and built her days around routines that felt steady and self-directed. No one monitored her choices. No one interpreted her quiet as compliance. By winter, she purchased a modest house under her own name, funded entirely through her income and disciplined planning. Signing those documents felt different from the courtroom filings. This time, every page bore her consent, her intention, her authority. She changed her phone number. She did not respond to forwarded messages. Contact ended, not with an argument, but with absence. No final speech, no last confrontation, just a boundary that remained firm. Miranda came to understand something she had never been taught. Growing up, power is not found in winning against someone. It is found in no longer needing to stand across from them at all. Detachment, not revenge, became her greatest strength. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't in fighting back, but in stepping away with clarity. Real control begins where boundaries are honored and peace is protected. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Feel free to leave a like or subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this, shared quietly, thoughtfully, and with respect for the journey we all navigate.